This coming week marks the anniversary of the famous battles of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. Two contrasting battles from within the greater Anglo-Zulu War, both of which rolled out on the same fateful day, the 22nd of January 1879. One famous Zulu victory over the mighty British army at Isandlwana, where the pincer movement of the Zulus, the famous horns of the buffalo, enveloped the desperate British in the dim light of a solar eclipse. And then, later that evening, in an incredible show of resilience, a cluster of British soldiers, several of whom were incapacitated, held off an unrelenting Zulu attack on the old mission station at Rorke's Drift. A battle which, remarkably, saw more Victoria Crosses awarded than any other battle in history. And in 2005 I finally made the pilgrimage to Zululand in order to listen to the stories of these battles from the master raconteur, David Rattray. We sat in a small horseshoe around him on the lawn outside that old mission station, just as the shadows were lengthening, while the sounds of an unaccompanied Zulu choir floated gently through the windows of an adjacent church. And while I came to learn of some very resourceful Welshmen that afternoon, Williams and Jones and Hook the cook, what really moved me was David's ability to inspire in me a fascination and respect for the Zulu people. An experience which, more importantly, opened my eyes to the potential healing powers lying largely dormant within our South African past. Potential which, through the founding of Inherit South Africa, I am now looking to unlock. But my story today isn't about Isandlwana or Rorke's Drift. For these stories, which cover the final days of the sovereign Zulu Empire, are already so beautifully told by the people who lived and worked alongside Rattray for so many years. Indeed, his old friend Rob Kasky tells the story with supreme authority, and then I believe that David's sons are serving his proud legacy with great skill at Fugitives Drift. Instead, today's Friday story delves into the opposite end of the life cycle of the Zulu Empire, the curious sequence of events leading up to the founding of the Zulus as a nation in 1816. Indeed, you may be surprised to learn that this mighty Zulu Empire, once the most powerful army in Africa, a nation who have captured the imagination of the world, was only ever a sovereign, independent empire for 63 years. As Rattray points out, less than a healthy human lifespan. And we know with surprising detail the origins of these people, because the Zulu people take a keen interest in their own history, remembering through increasingly cryptic songs of praise up to 12 generations of their own ancestors. So it is known that in the late 17th century, a chief called Mandalela journeyed down from the north through the eastern coastal regions along the Mfukune River, later settling on land alongside the White Mfolozi River in current-day central Zululand. And under Mandalela and later his son Zulu, meaning heaven, this band of northern Nguni people flourished into a fully fledged clan, adopting the name Zulu in recognition of their chief, but also, no doubt, in reference to the beautiful, well-watered land which they had secured, for this rolling landscape really is God's country. And after Chief Zulu followed Punga, and Mageba, and Indaba, and Jama, and then by the late 18th century, a famous chief called Senzangakhona. By this time, the Zulus numbered perhaps 1,500 people, and were living on land spanning approximately 10 miles on each side. They were a relatively small clan, living and competing in relative harmony with other similar-sized clans. And one of these little neighboring clans, indeed directly adjacent to the Zulus, were the Elangeni. And as a function of their history, they were therefore closely related by blood to the Zulu people. Indeed, Chief Senzangakhona's mother was, for example, an Elangeni, a fact which, given their strict customs governing incest, meant that Elangeni women were forbidden to Senzangakhona. And this is where the complication starts. Because a young Elangeni maiden had fallen for Chief Senzangakhona. She was a strong-willed daughter of the late Elangeni chief. Her name was Unandi, meaning the sweet one. And while a relationship developed between the two, marriage was, because of the strict customs preventing exogamy, out of the question. However, a few months later, an Elangeni messenger brought news indicating that Unandi was pregnant, and indeed that the father was none other than Chief Senzangakhona. Now this would of course have been most unwelcome news to the Zulu chief. For not only would he have had several disgruntled wives to answer to, but he also had breached their people's tight customs governing incest. And all this was exacerbated by the fact that this was the daughter of a neighboring chief, no less. So the sweating Senzangakona chose instead to buy himself some time, sending back an explanation of convenience, proclaiming that Unandi wasn't in fact pregnant, but rather that this must simply be the work of an intestinal beetle on which menstrual irregularities were usually blamed, a beetle known as an ishaka. Now this message would not have pleased the Ilangeni, although for now they were forced to swallow this explanation. But in time, of course, the season came to pass. And with that, another Ilangeni messenger was sent out to the Zulus. This time, however, he sarcastically summoned Senzangakona to come and collect Unandi and her Ishaka, a derogatory name which, despite Senzangakona naming the child Skidi, would unfortunately stick. So Senzangakona was now finally forced to address the uncomfortable situation. And the difficult decision was taken that, notwithstanding the issue of bloodline, Unandi was to be married, with a herd of lobola duly paid. But this marriage was of course riddled with scandalous undertones, and could never really be properly celebrated, because Unandi was in a state of disgrace, and that stigma would tragically be extended to her innocent infant son, Shaka. The result was that Shaka's childhood would be a deeply unhappy one. He was ostracized and taunted, and his mother would, as a result, be the only person he ever trusted. But she too was a pariah, a state which no doubt contributed to her failed marriage to Senzangakona 6 years later in 1793. And this separation saw Unandi pack up her possessions, and together with her traumatized little boy Shaka, they walked back to her own people, the Elangeni. But unfortunately here, Unandi and Shaka were even less welcome, for not only did they retain their stigma, but now the not unsubstantial herd of lobola had to be returned to the Zulus. So here Shaka would grow up, fatherless, among a people who despised both him and his often tempestuous mother. He was to be the butt of every cruel joke, and the only person he could turn to was his equally traumatized mother. And so, shoulder to shoulder, they faced up to a hostile world. And when famine struck in 1802, Nandi and the by now 15-year-old Shaka were classified as but an extra mouth to feed, evicted from the Elangeni. And so began a journey which eventually saw Unandi taking shelter at her aunt within the Mdletshe clan, which had been incorporated into the expanding Zulu Empire. And this move would finally signal a change to the bad luck which had until then dogged Shaka all of his young life. Because not only was he finally freed of his stigma, but also something special was brewing within the Zulu Empire. For their dynamic leader Dingiswayo was implementing a successful new model of expansion, which was transforming the Zulu Empire into the most powerful force in the region. And importantly, Dingiswayo's expansive strategy provided ample opportunity for combat, because it was in the military that Shaka began to find meaning. For not only had he now transformed into a magnificent young man, well north of 6 foot and a block of muscle, but his traumatic childhood seems to have functioned as the fire which hardened the stick, because Shaka proved to be a fearless and ruthless warrior, emerging as the natural leader of his local regiment. And in time, Dingiswayo incorporated this local Mdletshe regiment into the powerful Izitwe regiment of the mighty Mtetwa army. And here, Shaka's reputation continued to flourish, rising through the ranks of the regiment and eventually earning the right to lead it. Indeed, the military had provided Shaka an outlet for a lifetime of pain and frustration. He became a student of the battlefield, and he began to implement a series of innovations into his regiment, innovations which would forever change the face of conflict in the greater region. Notably, Shaka regarded the throwing spear as a ridiculous weapon for war, substituting it instead for a single broad-bladed stabbing assegai designed for hand-to-hand combat. And then similarly, he converted the traditional defensive shield into an offensive weapon, a tool used to hook in behind the enemy's shield, so enabling the warrior to drag the enemy into position, so exposing his flank, into which the stabbing spear, the onomatopoeic "iitla," would be sunk. And his approach was proving to be spectacularly successful, because in addition to giving his soldiers a clear advantage on the battlefield, it also introduced a far bloodier form of hand-to-hand battle, which saw casualties soar, a development which was striking new fear into the hearts of clans living on the outskirts of the expanding Zulu Empire. And ironically, to the north, the Isandlwana regiment was beginning to encroach dangerously close to Shaka's old Zulu clan. Indeed, his father, Chief Isandlwana, on hearing of the devastating military power of the Mtetwa regiments, agreed to the suzerainty of the Mtetwa, without so much as a fight. Although at this stage it is unlikely that he realized the hefty influence of his long-forgotten son, Shaka. But Shaka hadn't gone unnoticed to Dingiswayo. For Dingiswayo, who had emerged as a mentor to Shaka, saw in him not only a fierce warrior, but also a natural leader. Indeed, Dingiswayo realized that if Shaka could somehow return to lead the Zulus, he would provide a powerful buffer on the northern border of his Mtetwa Empire. And so when Isandlwana died in 1816, Dingiswayo immediately released Shaka from his military service and deployed him to lead the Zulus. Naturally, the Zulus were very weary of Shaka, a man they had last seen almost a quarter of a century before, as a traumatized 6-year-old boy walking over the horizon with his mother. But while the Zulu people were hesitant, Shaka was not. And he took up his leadership as if there had never been a question over his right. Indeed, from the very date of his arrival in 1816, the Zulus would forever leave the ranks of a sleepy upcountry clan, immediately commencing their march towards greatness. Although this was a traumatic journey, for Shaka dealt with any hesitation through instant death, and so any tentative opposition to Shaka quickly vanished. And then, using his considerable learnings from the Isandlwana regiment, Shaka proceeded to build the military strength of the Zulu people almost from scratch. And his refined tactics, which by now also included his famous pincer movement, the horns of the buffalo, saw the Zulu people achieve almost immediate military success, conquering and absorbing their neighboring clans. One of these clans were, of course, the Elangeni, the people responsible for Shaka's miserable childhood. Accordingly, the Elangeni people were paraded in front of Shaka, and anyone associated with his traumatic childhood was immediately executed in the most horrific fashion. However, Shaka still needed to proceed with some caution, for in principle, he continued to report to his old mentor Dingiswayo. However, in 1817, Dingiswayo was captured and killed by an enemy after a careless maneuver, succeeded by an incompetent half-brother who oversaw the rapid demise of the once mighty Mtetwa Empire. This now opened the door for Shaka, and he needed no second invitation, proceeding with a new intensity which saw the Zulus rise quickly to become the most feared nation in the greater region. Their domain now stretching from the Pongola River in the north to the Tugela in the south, and from the coast inland to the Ncome River. The original 100 square miles had by now been extended to 11,500, with his army by then numbering an estimated 20,000 men. And the Zulu Empire would continue to expand and thrive over the coming decades. However, Shaka's childhood demons would never really be defeated. He was always an outsider. He could lead his people, but he could never really join them. And so, the death of his beloved mother in 1827 was particularly painful, for he had lost his only real source of comfort, and in this pain he turned on his own people, inflicting a wave of executions across his domain, which seems to have contributed to his eventual assassination at the hands of his brothers in 1828. Shaka was duly succeeded by Dingaan and then Mpande and finally Cetshwayo. For it was under Cetshwayo's watch that the British, through the Anglo-Zulu Wars of 1879, put an end to Zulu sovereignty. A remarkable story and a remarkable nation.